Hello, my name's Sally Reid, and I wish that I could be there in person this weekend. I really do, but sadly I can't be. I'm speaking to you from near Rome in Italy, and I'm a writer and a poet and a convert to the Catholic faith. So I understand that your day today is all about why faith matters and about the church and the importance of the sacraments in our lives. First of all, perhaps if I tell you something about my background, and then I'll tell you something about my own conversion, because probably that will explain a lot about why faith matters to me, and perhaps it will be helpful to you in turn. I was brought up an atheist in a very atheist family. So my father was, a proper atheist Marxist who schooled me in quoting Marx and taught me that organised religion is absolutely evil from a very early age. And I really had the impression that Christians were particularly intellectually wanting. So that's the position that I was in as a child. Then as I grew older, I very much wanted to engage in altruistic work. I really wanted to work somewhere where I could do good and I could look after people. So I volunteered with people with learning disabilities, and then I became a psychiatric nurse and worked in London for a short while. And I loved the work. I absolutely loved it. And I was in my 20s, and I was in the dating scene in London. I was living, first of all, in the nurse's home and then on my own. And the work was, quite arduous and quite compelling. And I think that I turned to poetry at that time, strange as it may seem, as a way of dealing with what I was seeing in the wards and with the terrible stories that I was hearing, because there was an awful lot of suffering, and there was a lot of death, and there were a lot of people who were dealing with psychosis, etc. So there was an awful lot of chaos, and to make sense of the chaos, I turned to literature, which was understandable. My father was a journalist, and I've always loved reading and I've always loved writing. And that was when I really seriously started to write poetry. It was as if I could write a poem about a terrible situation, I would give it form and I would give it meaning. And looking back, I realised it was a kind of idolatry. That really was my religion at the time. I thought that poetry was the most important thing in the world, and suddenly it became clear to me that I had to become a poet at any cost. It was kind of mad, really. But I suppose there are worse vices. But I think, psychologically, it can be quite damaging to look for form in places where it runs out. Poetry can only take you so far. Nevertheless, I was always a searcher in my time in London. I think I wanted, in a sense, religion, but I could find no reason to believe in God, and I found organised religion to be evil beyond words. I despised it. I really despised it. But I want to talk about a particular time in my past, and this isn't about my whole life. In fact, I have a book about the conversion, and in the book I really specifically talk about the 9 months that my conversion took, because it happened in a very short period of time. And I only go back to my past for a particular period, because it seems to me that it was a very important sort of pre-time for me, a time that God prepared me for that later conversion when I was in my early 20s. I think perhaps it's common that we all have a time where we really, really fall rock bottom. And for me, it was when I was in London nursing, and I was in a very bad relationship. I was hopelessly in love, and the man in question was not available. And at the same time, my father, at the age of 56, was given 3 months to live. And I was nursing very, very troubled people. And at that time, my world really did seem to fall apart in the most astonishing way. I really had a mental breakdown. And with all of that entailed, as people who have been through that will understand, my hair was falling out, all kinds of things. It was quite extreme. And I remember at one point sitting in the floor of my flat in London and saying aloud, I'm in hell. I'm actually in hell. And I remember that so clearly, and I don't think I understood remotely what that meant. But after I converted, I looked back and I realised that I was in hell, because hell is where we put ourselves when we're not close to God and we will not admit that God exists. And it was such a terrifying experience. I constantly had this feeling, and it was a breakdown, I'm not mad, but it was a breakdown. It was a constant feeling that I was sitting on the edge of a huge drop, and at any moment I could fall backwards and just fall and just crash onto the rocks below. This was the sensation I had when I was falling asleep at night, and even during the day for a short time. And after I converted and I read the Psalms, I kept reading of this reference to the pit, but also God as our rock. And I realised that although I felt as though I was falling into nothing and would smash myself to pieces on that rock, actually the rock was probably God. That through all of this nothingness and through all of this abyss, we think there is nothing, but there is God. So it was an interesting sort of symbol to me for how I really felt that I'd come to the end of everything and that nothing was there, but actually God was waiting for me. And years later, through much blackness and darkness, I found God, or he found me, more to the point. So if I can spool forward a little, and the reason I tell you about the atheism is that I think it's important to realise, it still is important for me and for my daughter, because we're the only Catholics in our family. The rest of them are still atheists, right? And we both have this sense of being able to see both worlds very clearly. I haven't given up my family just because they don't believe, and I haven't given up on my old friends. So I have sort of two sets of friends and two worlds to look at. And so I'm constantly having to remind myself of what I'm doing and where I am and why I believe what I believe. I'm not at all tempted to go back to the old world, don't get me wrong, but it's a constant reminder to me of how lucky I am to have faith and how blessed. So if we spool forward years to 2010, when I was 39, and I was no longer a nurse. In fact, important to note, I think perhaps with faith I would have stuck the nursing for longer. I think I became very burnt out, because I think I had a lot of natural good in me, but I think without faith and without God, without that supernatural help, we can get very burnt out. So at the age of 39, I was living in Italy with my husband, who is Italian, and he's not a practicing Catholic. And I was already a poet. I had achieved my big dream and my big goal, but it strangely did not fulfill me. I'd published 2 books, and the whole world of poetry was becoming to me very unsatisfying, because I think I was looking for ultimate truth in poetry. And I think in the old days, in the days of John Donne, Gerard Manley Hopkins coming later, even T.S. Eliot, I think truth was present in some of those poems. And I think very sadly, in today's contemporary literature, you don't find it. People are too scared to look for truth. They're always presenting these kind of strange man-made solutions to things, and they're ducking the big questions, and they're not refusing to face God. So I was finding poetry unsatisfying even as an atheist. I didn't know why. And I thought to myself, what can I do now? What shall I do? What can I write? So I thought I'd write something non-fiction. And I had a friend who was a doctor. We'd both had lots of experience of gynecological problems. And we decided to write a book for women about their anatomy, which we were going to call The Vagina and Owner's Handbook. I think there are many books like that now written, so I don't have to write it. And I think it's a good idea for a book. We were both struck by how little women understand their own bodies, etc., etc. And as we were planning this book, I was going to be in charge of research, and I'd made some friends in this Italian town who were American Catholics. I found their Catholicism deeply offensive. I found their views on abortion and contraception, really stupid and really offensive. But nevertheless, I had a little girl by this time, and they had lots of children. And I wanted my little girl to play with their children, so I was kind of being a little bit, sly and wanting to have some of their time but not get too involved with them. And I thought for the book it would be a good idea to talk to Catholic women about things like natural family planning. But these women would not talk to me. They knew I was an atheist, they knew that I hated the church, and they wanted no part of my project. So I thought then that I perhaps should talk to a nun. And although our town is full of nuns, and many of them taught at my daughter's nursery school, I just could not bring myself to go to my daughter's teacher and ask her if I could talk to her about her vagina. So in the end, I realised that there was this young priest in town called Father Gregory, and many people had said to me in the English-speaking community, "Oh, you should meet Father Gregory, he's such a great guy, you'd really like him." And I thought to myself, well, yeah, but, he's a Catholic priest. I don't want to meet him. I want nothing to do with him. At this point in 2010 was when there were loads of stories in the media of abuse in Catholic institutions, I think particularly in Ireland, and I was absolutely sick to my stomach. I felt, almost personally offended, and because I loved walking around Rome and going into the churches to see the art. I had a particular passion for paintings of Our Lady. And somehow these allegations seemed to take all that away. I thought I would never find peace in a church again, because I used to like going into these dark places in the cool in Rome and looking at the art. And I thought that I could never appreciate that kind of art again. So I was furious with the church. And then all of a sudden I thought to myself, well, perhaps I will contact Father Gregory and he can talk to me about the church's stance on sex, It was a kind of act of desperation with my research. So one day I got his email address, I wrote him an email, and it literally said, "Dear Father, I am writing a book about the vagina." And I thought that he would either be very angry or he would just ignore the email. But a day or two later, I got a response, and it was very funny. I mean, obviously, he had a sense of humour, and he realised it was a serious project, and he said he had a friend who was an ex-nun, and she might be just the person to talk to me. Once I received that email, I suddenly thought to myself, maybe this man who seems so intelligent and so nice and so funny, maybe he can tell me why such a person would be part of the Catholic Church. So I wrote to him again and I said, would you mind, while you're thinking, would you mind just answering some questions about the Catholic Church? And he said, sure. And I wrote him these questions, and they were things like, if you had your money in a bank that was shown to be linked to the mafia, would you not take your money out of the bank and put it somewhere else? So, now that you know the awful things that have been going on in the Catholic Church, why don't you just go to a different church? They were questions of this kind, and they were quite aggressive. And he got back and, he fought back and he kind of argued with me. I just want to tell you a little bit about Father Gregory and his story, because I think God sent me a very particular priest. For a start, he's a theologian, so there are no flies on him at all. And it's wonderful to know someone who really knows the truths of the faith, and there's nothing wrong and there's no ridiculousness about it. The second thing is that he is a Byzantine Rite priest, and he had recently fled Ukraine because he had been head of the monastic orders in Ukraine and Lithuania. It was a very big job, and he discovered corruption in the church there, and he had exposed it, and he had then been threatened with his life. He had a phone call one day saying, if you don't leave the country by such and such a date, you're going to be burnt alive in your car. And after that 2 weeks, they had another phone call saying, we're deadly serious, you're going to be burnt alive in your car. And these people had form. People were being burnt alive in their cars. So Father Gregory was eventually ordered to leave by the Vatican, and he came to Rome with nothing, because the Catholic Church is not like working for the BBC or Marks and Spencer's. You don't kind of leave with a pension and someone takes care of you. He left with just a few euro in his pocket and ended up in Santa Marinella, where he met this crazy poet who was writing a book about the vagina. So, in a sense, as I was dueling with Father Gregory, I was very aware that he was a good guy. He'd fought corruption, he'd stood up for good. So I'd kind of met my match in a strange way, but I was still just furious with the whole thing. And then some very strange things happened, and this is purely God, and God gave me this beautiful story to tell, so I hope you'll bear with me as I speak about what changed my mind, in essence. At this point, Father Gregory and I, our argument had kind of petered out. There was nowhere else to go with it. But that spring, this was in the March of 2010, and that spring I had 3 major experiences that are very hard to tell in a medium such as this, as I'm sure you can understand. And without wishing to sound like I'm trying to sell my book, it's kind of worth reading the book, because obviously it's good to read these things when I've had a chance to formulate the language. Many converts have had strange and mystical experiences, and in a sense mine was no less and no different. I'll just tell you briefly about the first 2 experiences, and perhaps in more detail the third. The first experience, I was very churned up at this time, and I wasn't sleeping, and this was the real feature of my conversion. I was having terrible insomnia. I just couldn't stop thinking, and I was reading for comfort a book that I've read and reread many times, called I Capture the Castle. It's a beautiful book, and in it the atheist 17-year-old protagonist, who wants to be a writer, goes to see the local vicar because she's in love with somebody and it's not working out, and she wants his wisdom and his advice. And he knows about this situation that she's in, and he talks to her about God. And just the way that he spoke to her about God, and the way that he spoke to her about art and God, he says that religion is the greatest of all the arts, and it does what every art attempts. It achieves communion with God. And when I read those words, I just put the book down. And I had read the words so many times before in my life and never given them a thought. I put the book down, and I suddenly realised that all of these poems I'd been writing, all of this searching that I was doing, it was true. I was trying to communicate with someone who was there. That there is this God who has written the greatest poem. He is the greatest poet. He's written the greatest poem. And it was like the top of my head had just been lifted off, and I suddenly realised it was possible that God existed. And that if God existed, he created me. And I had reason and I had purpose, and he knew me completely. It was a mind-blowing, as they say, experience, and in some sense simply intellectual at this point, but it was absolutely huge. It was so huge that I wrote to Father Gregory and I said, I may not be an atheist anymore. And he wrote back and said, I never thought you were that dumb. Anyway, the second experience happened a couple of weeks later. I had this kind of joy within me, but I didn't dare let myself be happy, because I thought, well, okay, if there's a God, then what God are we talking about? Is this the God of Islam, of Hinduism, Sikhism, the Christian God, heaven forfend? Which God is this? And one night I wasn't sleeping, and I went downstairs, and again I was reading, and this time it was T.S. Eliot. And when I went back upstairs to bed, I lay down, and I had a very odd experience, which I've since read. Other people have had very similar experiences. I was so tense, and I felt as though I'd been almost injected with a drug. I felt this wave of something just wash through me. And it was as though I was like melted candle wax. I suddenly became so soft and so yielding, and I just cried. These tears just washed down my face. And again, I don't want to dwell on this too much, because it's something that it was an event in my life, but how on earth do you explain that? How on earth do you explain it? But the next morning I wrote to Father Gregory and I tried to explain what happened, and he just wrote back and said, on Sunday it's Pentecost. I didn't know what Pentecost was, and I didn't know what had happened to me. And I still had no peace at all. And I think this is very important. I'd kind of understood that there was a God. The Holy Spirit, I think, had come to me in some form and softened me up and kind of straightened me out in a strange way. But I still had no peace. And it wasn't until about a week later that I stopped into this little church near my daughter's nursery school, because I'd taken to going in there just to think, just for the peace. And I went into this church, and I sat on this pew with my feet up on the kneeler, and I looked up, and there was this icon of Christ's face in the stained glass. And I actually spoke aloud. I was crying. I was so upset. It was as if all my beliefs of the past had been turned over. I couldn't write a thing. Everything seemed up in the air. And I looked up and I said to Christ out loud, if you're there, you have to help me. And as I said those words, it felt as though I was almost physically lifted up. My tears just dried, my face relaxed completely. And it was as if I'd had amnesia, and somebody walked into the room who I knew and gave my whole self back to me. In the fullest sense that I'd ever known. I was more myself than I'd ever been. And when I walked out of the church, I knew I was a Christian. I knew I would never desert Christ. And every day I started to pray the Our Father, because I knew it was the prayer that he taught the disciples to pray. I knew from my school days. So I knew I was a Christian, but at the same time, I did not want to be a Catholic. My goodness me. So, why did I become a Catholic? I remember saying to Father Gregory at that point, well, why would I belong to any church? I'd begun to read the Gospels because I wanted everything from the horse's mouth, right? I didn't want any kind of like new age or trendy vicar telling me what to do. So I read the Gospels, and I read in Matthew where Christ says, go into your room in secret to pray, and God knows that you pray. And I said, I'll just pray in my room in secret. But at the same time, even as I said those words, I knew that somehow that wouldn't satisfy me. I mean, I'm not the kind of, I'm an introvert. I don't like big gatherings. I didn't want to go to church to get together with people and have a big sing-along. I just didn't fancy that in the slightest. But I somehow knew that being on my own was not the right thing. I was still missing things. And I still had huge issues with the church, with the abuse, with much of church doctrine about gay marriage, about contraception. So I didn't know what to do, but I was searching. I mean, at this point I had Christ. I was praying every day, so I had Christ with me. And it was like he was carrying me, but I was still very, very churned up. And that particular summer, I went to London, which is where I'm from. And I met up with a friend of mine, and we were talking in St. James's in Piccadilly, which is an Anglican church. And I said to her, I agreed with Simone Weil, who's a wonderful, wonderful writer and mystic, French. I said, I agreed with Simone Weil, who loved Christ, but she felt she wanted to stay on the outside of the church with the marginalised. And I said to my friend, my best friend, I said, I think I need to stay on the outside with the people who are marginalised and don't feel included in the church. And we talked on, and I was so passionate about how wrong the church was and how bad the church was, and all of a sudden my best friend said to me, if you care so much about the church, maybe you shouldn't stay on the outside, maybe you need to be on the inside. And I thought that was so wise. I could suddenly see that if I belonged to the church, I would be part of the church. So right, if I think I'm so good, I should add myself to the body of Christ, and perhaps hopefully there are a few good cells there. A few bad ones, but a few good ones too. So that was a real, I think, turning point, but it certainly wasn't the end of the story. Because that summer, as I walked around London, I kept wanting to go into a church and finding Christ as I'd found Christ in Santa Marinella that day that I spoke to him. And I would go into a church, and it wasn't a Catholic church, and it didn't feel right. I didn't know what a tabernacle was. I didn't know about the altar of reserve. But if I went into an Anglican church, I was kind of like, yeah, I just don't get this. So I was going around looking for Catholic churches, and every one I went to was shut. You couldn't get into it, which I think was no coincidence at all. I finally went to Soho because I remembered that in Soho there is a church called St. Patrick's, which is beautiful, and I remembered as being a nurse and seeing it as I walked past when I was working there. And I went to St. Patrick's, and it was shut for renovation. I was so desperate to be close to Christ in a Catholic church, and then I realised that it was the Eucharist I was needing to be close to. It was that presence of Christ that I was needing to be close to. And I became desperate to receive communion. It was all I wanted. But at the same time, I was reading. I was reading Julian of Norwich. I was reading Teresa of Avila. I was reading St. John of the Cross. So I was understanding more and more about faith. And it wasn't until the end of the summer when I got the Penguin Digest of Thomas Aquinas. And he's a hard read, right? But somehow as I read the bits and pieces I could understand, I suddenly saw how logic is inseparable from love. And I suddenly saw how the church really is a poem in the way that it's constructed. And if you change a bit, like in a sonnet, if you change a word or you change a line, it just throws the whole thing off. And I saw how everything was very much in balance. And you can't change church teaching. And it's about man and woman, and it's about the priest as the figure of Christ, and it's about Our Lady and the role of women, and it's about the truth of life, and about being fed, being literally fed by God. And I saw how we have to deny ourselves to follow Christ. And everything seemed to fall into place in a very, very calm and settled way. So I realised then that I simply had to be Catholic. And then it was a question of how do we do that? And I was told I would have to study for 4 years to become Catholic in Rome. But somehow the Lord worked, and one way and another. On the 14th of December in 2010, I was due to be received into the church in Rome. And by a strange twist of providence, shall we say, that day there were demonstrations in Rome and much violence, and people had set fire to things, and roads were blocked off, so I couldn't reach. I could get to the church where I was supposed to be received, but the cardinal who was due to do it but couldn't get there. That was Cardinal Cottier. And he said to me on the phone, you know, if you want to turn around and walk back across the city, I'll receive you in the Vatican. So that's what we did. We walked across the city, and I was received actually in the Vatican, in the chapel of St. Martha, which is where Pope Francis lives. And that was on the feast of St. John of the Cross in 2010, 10 years ago. So that in brief, very briefly, is my story, which God created and sent to me. I mean, when I looked back on events, I realised that it was so perfect. The 3 visitations that I had in that spring were the Father and the Holy Spirit and the Son. And the journey that I took from March to December, from the Annunciation to Christmas, was 9 months. So it was the most beautiful, beautiful story that was given to me to change my life and for me to write down. For other people, at first I wasn't sure that I should write it down, but since the book came out, people have told me that they found it very useful, and it's interesting to see how other people's experiences are in many ways similar to mine. At the same time, everyone's story is completely unique. So, what would I say to you about why faith matters? And 10 years on, am I glad I did it? I am extremely glad that I am a Catholic, and I could not live without the sacraments. I made some notes here about things that might be useful to you. Yes, what my best friend said to me that day in St. James's in Piccadilly is so true when she said, if you care so much about the church, shouldn't you be in it? That's so true. Of course, there's rot in any kind of human collection of people. So there's going to be the bad people, okay? But we have to remember that it's the saints that we're striving to be like, and the church is full of goodness, and it's often goodness that we just don't hear about. Moreover, as I say in my book, as I was reading and studying, I realised that the Catholics have all the best people. You know, all the saints and the mystics. It's just so rich. You know, it's just unbelievable, the journey that you're on as a Catholic. And I think what's really wonderful is if you read Julian of Norwich, whose writings are just luminous and lucid, what she says is that Christ said to her that her visions were for every single Christian, not just for her. So, in a sense, if you're like my daughter and you say, oh, you know, but I don't have any experiences during prayer and Christ's never come to me, we have to remember certain things. The first is this, that whenever Christ gives a real private revelation to a person, it's for the whole, it's for all of the body of Christ. So Julian of Norwich's revelations are for us as well as for her. And that's a very common thread. I recently translated the diary of an Italian mystic who's on the road to canonization, and she says the same thing in her diaries. These visions are for everybody, not just for me. So we're all interconnected. And even, our Blessed Mother with the Annunciation, my book Annunciation is all about how the Annunciation is for all of us, not simply for Mary. She received the physical Christ in her the day of the Annunciation so that we could receive the physical Christ in us through the Eucharist. So if we're feeling spiritually dry and we're thinking, well, why am I in Mass? What is it all about? We have to remember a couple of things. The first is that every Mass is a miracle. The consecration at the altar is a miracle that we are witnessing. And if we can't take that on board through a particular time, that's okay. It's okay because it is. It is. It doesn't need us to make it happen. It is happening, okay? And other people, and perhaps yourself at another time, will have these amazing connections with God, and they will hopefully write them down so that we can be helped by them, because the saints really, really, really help us. Periods of feeling disconnected from God, that's okay because we have the sacraments, because we have the Mass. We are always in touch with God, and He is there. I could go on for ages, but I'm aware that I'm talking to a camera, and so I should probably wind this up. I'm just going to read a little passage from the end of my book Annunciation, because this was really written to my daughter, who was always saying, why should I go to Mass? What's the point? And this is just a short passage before I finish. The bliss of the Mass is also this. It precisely doesn't require philosophical expertise. God did all the thinking for you. He gave you a place, the church building, and He gave you a time when Mass is offered. And He gave you your sacrifice, not a bird or a bull, but the body and blood of His only Son. He asks only that you come. And then He lets you into eternity and makes the death of His Son, which is over and done with once and for all, something that is always, that counts for always, that is happening now. But there's something else. You know that we offer the sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ on the altar, but God also wants you. Since Adam and Eve's exit from Eden, sacrifice has been our central way of communicating with God. And in the Mass, He is asking for you. When you offer up Christ, you are also asked to offer up the whole of yourself to God, your happiness as well as your sorrow, everything that you are. Listen, this is the Father calling you back to Himself. You are doing what our first parents did not ultimately do. You are recognizing that you belong to Him. As much as you worry that you don't do things right, there is nothing in you that is not pleasing to God when you hand it to Him. Humiliations, losses, sins, accomplishments, or ecstasy. You do not lose those things by giving them to Him. Rather, in His hands, they are transformed, given meaning, and made holy. God is the ultimate artist, and as with any master, there is not one expression of yours that He will not delight in perfecting. What I said to you as a 9-year-old is no different from what I will say to you as an adult. Just open the door. Okay, so that's my advice, is to open the door to God and to partake of everything the Church has to give you. God bless and have a wonderful day. Bye.